All right, picture this. Step quietly with me into the echoing heart of a medieval castle. Right as the sun sinks and the temperature plummets faster than you'd ever expect. You feel the cold almost instantly, right? That sharp little pinch on your cheeks the second you cross the threshold. The air tastes of smoke and damp stone, and as those heavy wooden doors slam shut, you realize something pretty profound. The darkness in here, it's not just an absence of light. It feels like a physical presence.
Okay, let's dive into this, because to really understand this world, we have to completely toss out our modern assumptions. We live in this era of continuous invisible heating. When we get a bit chilly, we press a button and boom, our environment obeys. But that modern comfort is actually incredibly fragile. I mean, if our external grid fails, our homes basically become uninhabitable within hours. So how on earth did our ancestors, living in these massive stone fortresses during brutal winters, actually survive the night without freezing to death? Well, the answer doesn't lie in brute force, but in this completely forgotten brilliance of human resilience and adaptation.
Now, you might be wondering, weren't these places basically giant stone iceboxes? Actually, scratch that. The historical evidence completely shatters that assumption. If we look at the incredibly meticulous household accounts of Westminster Palace from way back in 1275, the interior temperatures of occupied halls actually hovered between a remarkably comfortable 58 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit.
And here is the real kicker from those exact same accounts. During one of the absolute coldest winters on record in 1309, they managed to achieve that warmth with fires burning for only 6 to 8 hours a day. No way, right? It turns out warmth was meticulously engineered without needing a constant roaring fire. They completely understood thermal mass, capturing the heat in the stone and letting it release slowly through the darkest hours of the night.
Section 1. The hierarchy of warmth, class, space, and survival.
So as that central fire inevitably died down, the cold started to reclaim the castle. And it's here that we see how the literal architecture of survival was totally intertwined with your social rank. The lord and lady, they'd retreat upwards to a private room called the solar, all cozy and heavily curtained beds. High-ranking attendants stayed close to power, literally sleeping on trundle beds pulled out right from beneath the master's bed so they could serve them at a moment's notice. Meanwhile, the lower servants were relegated to the Great Hall or even down in the damp basements. They were just jostling for shared space on mattresses or honestly simply bedding down in the herb-strewn rushes right on the hard stone floor.
And rank carried some profound, sometimes deadly ironies. Take a look at the layout of the 13th century Goodrich Castle. The most luxurious noble rooms are tucked away as far from the kitchens as humanly possible. Why? Well, medieval kitchens, with their roaring ovens, were massive fire hazards. But for the servants, the brutal reality of winter meant they often actively sought out sleeping spots directly above or near those super dangerous kitchens. They literally gambled with the risk of burning alive just to absorb that residual heat and fight off the biting frost.
Section 2. The technology of bedding, engineered microclimates. And this brilliantly illustrates how, for those who had them, beds were way more than just furniture. They were highly advanced pieces of survival technology. Having a bed with heavy curtains wasn't just about privacy or showing off how much money you spent on textiles. It created a vital microclimate, a literal pocket of tolerable, still air deliberately trapped by dense fabric in a room where the temperature outside the curtains might be plummeting toward freezing.
Think of it kind of like an archaeological dig through layers of fabric. The absolute base layer was smooth linen, which gave you that nice, cool comfort against the skin. But the true core of medieval survival? Wool. Heavy, coarse, incredibly densely woven wool that trapped heat and absorbed moisture without ever actually feeling wet. And finally, a thick tapestry canopy sealed off this whole microclimate from the icy drafts whistling through the window slits. These textiles required immense skill and endless hours of labor to make, and they were, quite literally, the difference between life and death.
But hey, the technology didn't stop at the mattress. A medieval sleeper essentially wore a second bed. Just imagine a servant out in the Great Hall, sitting by the fading embers, meticulously darning the heels of heavy wool socks by the pathetic light of a tallow candle. When they slept, they wore thick woolen overshirts and, absolutely crucially, tight nightcaps to stop heat from escaping through their head. Even their leather shoes were perfectly positioned for those freezing late-night dashes to the chamber pot. Every single garment was an intentional, calculated barrier against the elements.
Section 3. The segmented night, breaking the 8-hour myth.
Now, navigating the physical cold was really only half the story. To truly step into this world, we have to completely toss out our modern idea of a good night's sleep. That uninterrupted 8-hour block of sleep we all crave, it's a completely modern invention. Historical records show a totally different rhythm, the two-sleep cycle. The night was this fluid, segmented experience.
Folks would bed down shortly after dusk, around 8 p.m., for what they called a first sleep. Then, right around midnight, they would just naturally wake up. And this wasn't insomnia. This was totally expected. For an hour or two, they'd pray, chat quietly, tend to the fire, or do simple chores like mending clothes. After that, they'd head back for a second sleep until dawn.
So, the crucial point is that before the rigid tyranny of the mechanical clock, time was just experienced so differently. It was measured by the natural fading of the light, the shifting of the seasons, and the steady rhythm of religious duties. This total lack of fixed hours allowed people to safely and naturally potter about during the absolute darkest, most isolating time of the night. It turned the long, scary winter darkness into something communal and, honestly, incredibly useful.
Section 4. Echoes of the Past. The Sensory Castle.
When we bring ourselves back into that segmented night, we realize the sleeper is inhabiting what is basically a massive living instrument. Architectural historians have noted this really fascinating reality. As that freezing air sets in, massive timber beams start to contract. The dead silence of the night is constantly broken by this, little clicks, sudden pops, and deep resonant creaks traveling like voices right through the walls. The castle itself is literally groaning under the weight of the frost, serving as this constant haunting reminder of the fragile architectural boundaries standing between you and the deadly elements outside.
The sensory reality of the medieval night was just incredibly rich. While your ears caught the thrumming of the timber, your nose might pick up the sharp scent of rosemary and mint. They'd steam these herbs on hot stones or dip them in oil to release comforting aromas, a tiny luxury to encourage a little vigor in the limbs. And if you were a child or an elder, the absolute most vulnerable folks in the household, your sensory world was intensely focused on one thing, the gentle, vital heat radiating from the carefully banked ashes of the hearth. It was a tiny, glowing lifeline, carefully curated just for your survival. And we know these sensory decals aren't just some romantic fantasy. They're firmly grounded in hard physical evidence. At sites like Bodiam Castle in England, archaeologists study the specific hearth designs, the layers of charcoal deposits, and the exact patterns of soot creeping up those stone walls. This physical record proves just how masterfully these ordinary survivors engineered their environment. They squeezed absolutely every ounce of utility out of the meager resources they had.
Which brings us to a pretty haunting reflection. We tend to look back at the medieval night and see nothing but hardship, cold, and darkness. But, they understood their world and their exact place within it, with an intimacy that we have almost entirely lost. Their survival required deep knowledge, genuine community care, and an absolutely ingenious partnership with their physical environment. So as we sit in our perfectly climate-controlled rooms, completely dependent on a delicate, invisible grid, we really have to ask ourselves, in our relentless pursuit of absolute comfort, have we accidentally sacrificed the incredible, robust resilience of our ancestors? Think about that tonight, right as you switch off the lights.